Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. My Thomas Pynchon experience began not very originally with The Crying of Lot 49, which went completely over my head, I'm gonna admit that. I nevertheless decided to give B a chance shortly after I read that novella, and this one blew me away. It was a very challenging read, but I was struck by its inventiveness, its sheer virtuosity. So V has actually been one of the formative experiences for me as a reader. This summer, I decided to revisit V. So I went to the library, I got a different copy because I like to do that sometimes when I am rereading a book. And I am now even more amazed by this text. So what I wanted to do is, I wanted to put together a video that would be the usual book review / analysis that I do, but that would also function as a kind of a reader's guide. Because, as you know, Thomas Pynchon has that reputation of being a difficult author. Just so you know, I am also going to be releasing another video that is going to be very similar to this one, but in Spanish. Because I think this is a novel and this is an author who calls for that. And I figured if I can do it, why not, right? So that's something to look out for. And finally, for this introduction, I have very good news. This video marks the beginning of a podcast that is going to be dedicated to Thomas Pynchon. So there's going to be a lot more to come on this great author, more content that I hope you will enjoy. I thought the first step towards a reading, understanding, appreciation of V should be a close look at its structure. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to put together a map, maybe an X-ray, though I like the concept of map because the concept of map is really key to the story that is told in this novel. So if you look at the physical object, this book is just about 500 pages in length. The story is divided into 16 chapters plus an epilogue. And one thing to understand is that V is a novel that is made up of lots of stories. We have a plurality of stories here, but primarily we have two threads to the novel. One of them deals with a group of people known as the Whole Sick Crew, and in particular with a character named Benny Profane. We have 11 chapters to that thread. And the other thread is dedicated to a certain Herbert Stencil, and there are 6 chapters to that one. These two threads are interlaced, that is the structure of the novel, and they come together at certain key points. Now there's another way of looking at this novel from the perspective of structure. I like to describe V as a contemporary story that is punctuated by interrelated tangential novellas. These are novellas that take place in different geographic locations and also in different time periods. So V is a global and ample novel. And this notion of the collection of novellas reminded me, as I was rereading this text, of Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell, which is one of my favorite novels ever. And because I thought of Cloud Atlas, of course, I could not help thinking of the novel that inspired its structure, which is, of course, Italo Calvino's If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about these towards the end of this video. And I'm also going to tell you about another connection that I made as I was reading this one, which is with Don Quixote. Because Don Quixote is also a novel that has many stories within it, right? So that's another thing we're going to explore later on in this video. But let's go back to that initial idea of the structure of this novel. This text consists of 2 threads, and each one deals mainly with one character. Okay, so V is a novel that has 2 protagonists, and each one of them is on a quest. These are different quests, even though they meet at certain points. The first character of these 2 that we meet is Benny Profane. He is described as a schlemiel and a human yo-yo. A schlemiel because he is very clumsy, and the human yo-yo because he is moving, he is coming and going back and forth, but at the end of the day he is going nowhere. So Profane is looking for a job, he is looking for love. I think you can put together everything that he's looking for and say that he is looking for a purpose, just like me, you know, and so many other people on this earth. And then on the other hand, we have the character of Herbert Stencil, and he is looking for B. Okay, B. So we have here a first question for us readers. Who is B? What is B, right? And the answer to that is not provided, by the way. But if you want the beginning of the story, you can go to page 53 of this edition of the text, where Herbert Stencil finds in his father's journal the following entry. There is more behind and inside V than any of us had suspected. Not who, but what. What is she? God grant that I may never be called upon to write the answer, either here or in any official report. This is what triggers the quest of Herbert Stencil, and from that moment on he's going to be dedicated to looking for V, whoever or whatever that is. That is going to be his raison d'etre. The novellas within the novel deal primarily with this search for V by Herbert Stencil. Now, I want to throw at you some themes, okay, because I think it's always important to know what it is, what topics it is that we are dealing with. They are going to recur throughout the novel, of course, and you're also going to find them in this discussion, in this video. I think the most obvious one is dependence on technology. There's a preoccupation in V that as machines become more and more human-like, human beings become more and more like machines. So you have a humanization of the machine as you have a mechanization of the human being simultaneously happening. Another important theme is overinterpretation, that is reading too much into things. And I would say that this could almost be considered to be the most important theme in the novel. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this too. There's also a questioning of the concept of an individual self. You know, I like to think of myself as one person, as an individual, that I have this identity. But this novel doesn't really trust that idea or that view of things. There are more facets to each of us, right, than just that single identity. Another theme, decay, okay, especially societal decay, or if you want it in Pynchonian terms, entropy. We're going to look at this, okay? So let me share with you some thoughts that I found in this book. This is Bloom's Modern Critical Views on Thomas Pynchon, of course. And we have a definition here of entropy for our purposes in an essay that is, in fact, on The Crying of Lot 49, not on V, but it's a really good essay by Edward Mendelson. It is titled The Sacred, the Profane, and the Crying of Lot 49. And he says here about V, the book's central metaphor is the thermodynamic concept of entropy, which for the moment may be defined loosely as the slowing down of a system, the calcifying decay of life and available energy on a scale that may be minute or global. And he goes on talking about this. He says, almost all the incidents in V enact a decline of available energy, a hardening of living beings into artificial ones, a degradation from vitality to mechanism, a transfer of sympathy from human suffering to inanimate, objective existence. In the world of V, there can only be few alternatives to decline, and those few are weak. Some understated temporary acts of escape and love, a sudden dash into the sea as all the lights go out in a city, the reconstruction of a marriage. All the rest leads to stasis. Now, two side effects of that decay, that entropy, that societal problem that we have here are materialism and alienation. You're going to find plenty of examples of that. For example, the case of Rachel Owlglass, the character who's in love with her car. And then there's another key theme that we have to mention. It's one of the most important ones, actually, so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to leave it for last. And that is the dichotomy of patriarchy versus matriarchy. There's a book by Robert Graves titled The White Goddess, and some critics have pointed out that there are many connections between the White Goddess and V. By the way, the book of The White Goddess by Robert Graves is a speculative kind of analysis, but it's still very interesting. And in her book on Thomas Pynchon, Judith Chambers talks about this and makes this connection right here. She says, the woman V for whom Stencil searches is a fragmented, mutilated white goddess. The novel V documents Graves's argument that the shift to a patriarchal culture has made the need to know, to dominate, and to control the informing principle of action. What is lost is the ability to accept mystery and paradox. Tracing the emphasis on logic and science, which are symbolized by the worship of Apollo, Graves sees a shift away from the sacredness of the dark and mysterious force the goddess represents to the present emphasis on scientific truth as the truth. Pynchon uses Graves's analysis to explore this decline, and although he does not argue for a return to sacred origins, his message and style suggest his belief in a retrieval of that sacredness to take it forward, to do the world's work, to, quote, love with your mouth shut. So those are some ideas on the themes that I think are helpful. Now we're going to go into the story or the stories that make up this novel. So as we said before, 11 chapters of V are dedicated to the whole sick crew, and in particular to Benny Profane. So the question here is, what is the whole sick crew? To put it simply, this is a group of artist friends / acquaintances who are pretty much aimless and hedonistic. There's something here that I was thinking as I read this and about the whole sick crew. I made the connection with Cortázar. If you remember, in the novels of Julio Cortázar, the family has been displaced by the group of friends. The group of friends is really the social unit. So basically, in the novels of Cortázar, sometimes you don't even have fathers, children, or anything like that. V is not exactly like that. There are fathers and there are sons and daughters. But you know what I'm saying. The whole sick crew is really the family in this case. And there's a character by the name of Paula Maestral. She is very important to the novel. And in chapter 13, she's talking about the whole sick crew, and she says, that crew does not live, it experiences. It does not create, it talks about people who do. And Benny replies, it's fun. He's part of the whole sick crew, right? But then Paula says to him, and you are becoming less of a man. So as this group, the whole sick crew, decays or goes into this entropy kind of thing, it becomes clear that Benny, if he wants to find a way out of his problem, he needs to get out of that environment. This thread of the novel is quite straightforward. It is not that part of the novel that is complex. The complex part, or the more complex one, is the stencil thread. And you can see this primarily in chapter 3. Because in that chapter, the character of Stencil, he impersonates 8 different characters. This is one of the most challenging chapters in the novel, particularly because it happens very close to the beginning of the text. Another thing that happens and that complicates things with Stencil is that he refers to himself in the third person, just like Henry Adams in The Education of Henry Adams. He suffers from forcible dislocation of personality. That is how it is put in the novel. So he has a repertoire of identities. In chapter 11, Fausto Maestro, so he is Paula's father, he refers to this idea of the false notion that identity is individual. He says, the false assumption that identity is single, sole, continuous. So throughout the novel we have this put into question of the concept of an individual identity, and this also concerns B, the character, because you're going to see that throughout the novel this entity or this concept goes through many manifestations or many iterations as the story progresses. V could be a character named Victoria Wren, it could be Venezuela, it could be the mythical land of Vesu, which in turn could be a code name for Venezuela according to one of the characters. It could also be Valletta, the capital of Malta, Veronica Manganese. There are many more characters and many more concepts that begin with this letter. So that is what I mean by this idea that we don't have individual identities anymore. That has exploded. So as Stencil looks for B in the present, which is the end of 1955 and the beginning of 1956, there are several clues that lead him to events that took place in the past. And these are the novellas within the novel. So let me tell you a little bit about them. The first one, or the first important one that we have, is chapter 7. This one takes place in Italy in the time of Stencil's father. So we are going to the past here, as happens to be the case most of the time with the novellas within the novel. And it is concerned, the story, with the embassy of Venezuela. So you already have that V right there. There's a character named the Gaucho who may be trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government. So that's the first one. Then chapter 9 takes us to Southwest Africa in the 1920s, and this is primarily an indictment of colonialism. So the main character in this one is a guy named Mondaugen, and he goes there and he becomes obsessed with deciphering a code that comes through radio signals. So that's one example that you have of this concept of overinterpreting and reading too much into things. The next novella that we have is chapter 11, which is The Confessions of Fausto Maestro. This is a very important, a central chapter to the novel. And Malta is a key location for the text. And Fausto Maestro and his daughter Paula, they are from Malta. So the confessions are basically a letter that he writes to his daughter. And the tone, I would describe it as self-indulgent and self-critical at the same time. And it is here, it is in the Confessions of Fausto Maestro that we have this put into question of the notion of individual identity, because Fausto also sees himself as a series of avatars or different iterations of himself. So identity here is multiple. There has been a fracturing of personality. And in this novella, within the novel, you can see it in particular. Then we have chapter 14. This is a story of Mélanie Leur Maudit. She is an actress in Paris in the 1920s. She's going to appear in a play that is titled Rape of the Chinese Virgins, and she's going to play the character of Su Fang. The interesting thing about this play is that there are going to be automata that are going to be used as characters in the play. So there you have once again the notion of the mechanization of human beings and vice versa. And the main plot element in this story of Mélanie is her affair with V, which in this case is clearly a woman, maybe Victoria Wren, but remember that it is not clear at any point whether V is a single entity or not. And then finally we have the epilogue. This epilogue concerns old Stencil, so Herbert Stencil's father, Sidney, and it takes place in Malta in 1919, which is a time of political unrest and riots. So that gives you an idea of the novel itself, the structure, and the novellas that are included within it. Now, I want to tell you a little bit, as I said before, of some connections that I personally made while I was reading the text. And I mentioned Cloud Atlas and If on a Winter's Night, Traveler. I would say that the difference here with V is that V is not as neat as Cloud Atlas, and it is not as teasing as If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler. So if you remember, Cloud Atlas consists of novellas that begin, so you have beginning, 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 then you have a core in the middle, and then you have ending, ending, ending. So it's kind of a neat structure. If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler, on the other hand, has a bunch of novellas that begin, but they do not end. So it is frustrating, purposely, for the reader. And I think V stands somewhere in the middle, structurally speaking, between those two texts. V has also been compared to Ulysses, as you probably know. Here we have a total novel, we have an encyclopedic novel, we have a novel about two characters, right, who are on a quest and they cross paths towards the end of the story. Stephen is looking for a father. Stencil is looking for V, whoever or whatever that is, based on his dead father's notes. So you see what I'm saying. There are many connections between these two texts. Now there's a point, this is on page 385 of my edition, right here, where we have the character of Benny. He says something that maybe may sound a little bit offensive, if you will. He says, someday, please God, there would be an all-electronic woman. Maybe her name would be Violet. Any problems with her, you could look it up in the maintenance manual. Module concept, fingers weight, heart's temperature, mouth's size out of tolerance, remove and replace was all. So this idea of the mechanical woman, and also the idea that the name could be Violet, which begins with a V, reminded me of a novella, great novella that I have talked about, that I have done a video on, which is Felisberto Hernández's The Daisy Dolls, or Las Hortensias in Spanish. It's about a couple who are obsessed with dolls, but the idea here is that this concept of the mechanical woman can be found throughout the history of literature and even film. It goes from E.T.A. Hoffman's The Sandman to Blade Runner and that great movie Ex Machina, and you could continue adding to that. Think also of the character of the bad priest in the chapter of the Confessions of Fausto Maestro, okay, and how that character comes to an end, which is in turn related to, in the first chapter, the story of the man who had a screw in where his navel should have been. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to ruin the reading experience for you, but you can see all of these things are interconnected. Now, I have saved the best for last. Don Quixote. Okay? Cervantes' novel is also a story that contains little stories inside, right? So stories within the main story. And I said before that overinterpretation, this idea of reading too much into things, could be considered the main theme of V. Need I say more? I mean, Don Quixote is about a man who literally has read too much and continues to read too much into things. But Don Quixote is also the story of a man on a quest who is accompanied by the ultimate schlemiel, if you want to look at him that way. So I think you could say that Herbert Stencil is a kind of Don Quixote. He is the idealist, he is the dreamer. And then on the other hand, Benny is Sancho Panza, because he is the realist. And you can tell that even by looking just at their names. I mean, Benny Profane. Profane as in secular, just like Sancho Panza is a very down-to-earth character. Not a lot of metaphysical dimension to these characters. And on the other hand, the stencil is a two-dimensional thing that is used to reproduce something that existed before. So maybe we could look at Stencil as a reproduction of his father, because his father was also plagued by these obsessions and this search for meaning. And by the way, there is much, much more when it comes to name symbolism in this novel. I mean, think of names like Rachel Owlglass, Melanie L'Heure Maudit, and it keeps going, okay? Fausto Maestro. You can keep going. There are many, many ways to interpret these names. So finally, before we come to a conclusion, I wanted to share with you some quick observations / recommendations that would be part of the reader's guide component of this video. So let's do that. Don't let the text intimidate you. It is a complex novel. It is full of wonderful interconnections, but it is by no means unintelligible. Don't worry about chapter 3. Just read it and keep going. Definitely do not put the novel down because of this chapter. Okay, it's just one of those chapters that you want to read. It's not that important in the end. The novellas are tangential. By that I mean that not everything that is included in these novellas is absolutely necessary for an understanding of the novel. The structure is elliptical. So by the same token to what I said before, there is much that is important to the story that is missing from the text. V is a centrifugal text. It explodes all over the place from that core that is V. So this is like a literary Big Bang. V is also a satire that engages in parody. So this is a serious novel. It deals with very serious themes, but it shouldn't be taken too seriously because the very novel doesn't take itself too seriously. To quote the novel, logic is a human attribute after all. Almost by definition, we are beings who are always trying to make sense of things. We're always trying to find answers and to figure things out. One of the things that V does is to acknowledge that and to frustrate this human impulse that we have. It doesn't give you all the answers. Kind of like life, you know? Bottom line, V is freaking fantastic. Okay, it gave me more pleasure than any other text that I have read by Thomas Pynchon, but I have to say that this is the only one of them that I have reread. So I'm going to be reading and rereading some of the others as we continue with this podcast on Thomas Pynchon, and I will tell you what my opinion is as I continue to explore this author. I would really love to hear your thoughts on V in the context of the work of Thomas Pynchon or by itself, or any thoughts that you have on this author in general. So if you have any comments, questions, recommendations, recipes, you know that I am always happy to read them and to reply. Those were my 2 cents on V by Thomas Pynchon. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by. Have a wonderful day and keep cool, but care.